At 3 in the morning on May 24, 2026, a delivery rider was on Teodoro Street in Angeles City, Philippines. He had just dropped off an order. He heard a sound he initially mistook for an earthquake. It was not an earthquake. A 9-story building under construction had just collapsed onto the street. 30 to 40 construction workers had been sleeping inside. No natural disaster. No tremor. No warning that anyone outside the building would have heard. The question is not what brought the building down. The question is why anyone was sleeping inside it. The building at Teodoro Street in Barangay Balibaco was a condo hotel project. 9 stories of reinforced concrete in the finishing stages of construction. It had been under construction since 2020, 6 years to reach the finishing stages of a 9-story building. The developer was a man named Ernest Jackson Lim. The contractor was Golden Years Construction and Steelworks Corporation, based in Malabon, run by a man named Johnson Koo. Golden Years secured the building permit in 2023, 3 years after construction had already begun. Angeles City sits on the former grounds of Clark Air Base, one of the largest American military installations outside the United States until it closed in 1992. The land around the former base developed into a mixed economy, budget hotels, entertainment venues, apartment rentals, cheap land, growing demand, and 80 kilometers from Manila. The kind of market where a condo hotel made financial sense. The approved permit covered 9 stories. While construction was in its final stages, a 10th floor was being prepared, a roof deck with a swimming pool. A swimming pool is one of the heaviest loads a building can carry. Water weighs approximately 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. The 10th floor and the swimming pool were not in the original approved design. The permit said 9 floors. They were building 10. After the collapse, engineers from Opata Construction analyzed photographs of the debris. They reached a specific conclusion. The columns of the building were critically undersized for its height. In their assessment, the columns were designed to support a building of 3 to 4 stories. The building had 9, with a 10th under construction on top. In September 2025, 8 months before the collapse, the Department of Labor and Employment issued a work stoppage order against Golden Years Construction. Dole Region 3 Director Geraldine Panlilio visited the site. She found violations that were visible without any specialized inspection. Workers had no personal protective equipment, no safety gear, no proper illumination, no safety belts, no adequate scaffolding. Beyond the physical hazards, investigators also found that Golden Years had not registered its workers with SSS, PhilHealth, or PAG-IBIG, the mandatory social insurance, health insurance, and housing fund programs that Philippine law requires for every employed worker. The people building this hotel had no insurance of any kind. DLA issued the work stoppage order. Construction halted. Golden Years then submitted documentation showing it had addressed the violations. Dole Region 3 lifted the order in October 2025. 8 months later, the building collapsed. When investigators returned to the site after the collapse, they found that workers were still sleeping inside the building under construction. This was one of the specific violations Dole had flagged in September. Workers' barracks located inside an unfinished structure. The order had been lifted. The barracks were still there. It was a barracks located approximately 5 meters outside the building, separate from the main structure on the adjacent lot. Workers sleeping in that barracks survived when the building fell. Workers sleeping inside the building did not have the same chance. The placement of the barracks was not accidental. Someone at Golden Years Construction decided where the workers would sleep. They chose inside. Dole told them that was a violation. The stoppage order was lifted. The workers were still inside. Acting Labor Secretary Francis Tolentino stated this directly after the collapse. The workers' barracks should not have been located inside the building under construction. He said one of the reasons a worker survived was because one barracks located about 5 meters away was spared. He said Golden Years had failed to address the issue. The work stoppage order had been lifted because Golden Years said it had addressed the issue. Tolentino then placed Dole Region 3 Director Panlilio under 1-month preventive suspension to investigate, in his words, why the work stoppage order was lifted and whether Dole did everything necessary to protect the workers. The agency that issued the order, the agency that lifted it, now investigating itself. The collapse mode was what structural engineers call a pancake failure. Each floor slab lost its vertical support and dropped onto the floor below. The impact of each falling slab collapsed the next one down, floor by floor in sequence, until all 9 floors were compressed into the footprint of the ground level. A pancake collapse can complete in under 10 seconds. It leaves virtually no survival space between floors. The green safety netting that had wrapped the building's exterior was the only thing visible above the debris, draped over what had been 9 floors of concrete, now stacked flat. This is why the rescue operation lasted 11 days and recovered mostly bodies, not because the teams were slow, because a pancake collapse leaves almost nowhere to survive. A thunderstorm had passed through Angeles City the night before. Investigators noted it as a possible contributing trigger. A structural engineer's assessment was direct. A properly designed building should withstand ordinary rain. A thunderstorm does not collapse a correctly built 9-story structure. After the collapse, Mayor Carmelo Lozatin II went to the site. He called publicly on the building owner and the contractor to come forward and cooperate with authorities. He named them by name. He asked them to report to the command post to help verify how many workers had been inside. They did not come. The legal counsel for Golden Years Construction later explained that company representatives had been near the scene within hours of the collapse. They had chosen not to enter the immediate area. The reason given, they were concerned they might be mobbed because emotions were running high. Rescue workers were inside the unstable debris in the rain, in temperatures that the Bureau of Fire Protection described as a major challenge to operations. They were working in conditions where a secondary collapse was a documented risk. The people responsible for the building were standing outside because they were concerned about the crowd. They surfaced several days later after the mayor's repeated public calls. The headline from the Enquirer read, "Owner, contractor of collapsed Angeles site finally surface." Finally, 13 people died. 7 remained missing when search and rescue operations ended. 26 were rescued. One of the first people pulled from the rubble alive was a construction worker named Maricel Sapungay from Marilao, Bulacan. A relative, Mark Lawrence Sapungay, died in the collapse. Maricel survived. She filed the first criminal complaint, reckless imprudence resulting in homicide, against Ernest Jackson Lim, Johnson Koo of Golden Years Construction, and the site engineer. A 65-year-old Malaysian woman with a disability had been staying in the apartel next door. She was not a construction worker. She had no connection to any decision in this file. She reached rescuers by phone from beneath the rubble after the collapse damaged the adjacent building. She did not survive long enough to be pulled out. The workers who died had no social insurance, no health insurance, and no housing fund contributions. Golden Years had not registered them. If they were injured on the job before the collapse, they had no coverage. After the collapse, their families were left to seek compensation through criminal complaints filed in a prosecutor's office. Navi, the partner of one of the missing workers, told a reporter, "I may not have a lot of knowledge about these things, but I know the mistake lies with them. The engineer, the contractor, and the owner who is having that built. For the sake of our families, I hope we can all achieve justice." I personally think the Angeles City story is about a document, not the building permit, not the structural plans, the work stoppage order. In September 2025, a government inspector went to that construction site. She found by plain view, in her own words, workers without safety equipment, without scaffolding, without insurance, sleeping inside an unfinished structure. She issued a legal order to stop all work. That order was a written acknowledgement that the site was too dangerous for people to be in. 8 months later, people were still sleeping inside it. What happened between September and May is the entire story. Golden Years submitted paperwork saying it had fixed the violations. Dolly lifted the order. Nobody went back to check. And the specific violation that killed people, workers living inside the building, was still there on the night of May 24, unchanged. That is not a construction failure. That is a compliance system that accepted a piece of paper as a substitute for a person walking through the door. There is one detail that I think closes this file more completely than any other. The building was undersized in its columns from the beginning. Engineers assessed the debris and concluded those columns could support 3 to 4 stories. The project had 9 floors. A 10th was being added. A rooftop swimming pool was being built on columns designed for a structure less than half that height. That decision was made at the beginning, in 2020, before the first floor was poured. Everything else, the work stoppage, the lifted order, the barracks still inside, happened on top of a building that was already too heavy for what was holding it up. After the collapse, Dali announced a review of the process for lifting work stoppage orders, requiring mandatory on-site re-inspection rather than accepting contractor-submitted compliance reports. The building permit revision process for mid-construction floor additions came under national review. Angeles City launched a comprehensive audit of all active construction sites in Barangay Balibago. All of that came from a building whose columns were not strong enough to hold it, whose workers had no insurance, and whose barracks were still inside after an order specifically requiring them to be moved. This is document 6. This is what is in the file. The next file is Karachi. In 2023, the Sindh Building Control Authority declared a residential building in the Lyari district dangerous and unfit for habitation. They put it in writing. 2 years later, the building collapsed. People were still living inside it when it fell. The question in the Karachi file is the same one that runs through the Angeles City file, not what the paper said, what anyone did after it was signed. If you want to read that file when it opens, subscribe to Global Construction Files.